The apple that fell far from the tree. Shimshon Elia recalled to mind his great uncle Yechiel Moshe. What a fine and noble character he had. His generosity knew no bounds. Shimshon Elia knew little of the history of the old man, save what his mother had told him about her uncle Yechiel Moshe. His great uncle never spoke about his past. The old man's father was a very rich man who married to the daughter of a friend of his, equally wealthy. Both the father and father-in-law of his great uncle had their respective Bati Midrashis, where they maintained a group of students who devoted all their time to Torah study. They themselves also spent the greatest part of their time likewise. When Yechiel Moshe's father died in Prague, he left his son well provided for, but the biggest portion of his wealth he left to charity. Yechiel Moshe had no financial worries and lived happily with his devoted wife for 35 years, despite the fact that they had no children. After her death, he sold his home, gave the money it realized to charity, and went to live with Shimshon Elia's parents. First they lived in Krakow, and later in Vitebsk. Shimshon Elia remembered how his great uncle used to send out his agents to all the surrounding towns and townlets to seek out orphans, widows, needy students, or in fact anyone who was down and out and could do with a little financial assistance. Not only did he devote much time to studying the Torah, but he also conducted a shiur where he concentrated on the teachings of the Maharal of Prague. One of the teachings which Yechiel Moshe always tried to impress upon the listeners was that they should learn Hazinu and recite it every day, even several times a day. It was so uplifting that it would elevate all who recited it sincerely: merchants before doing business, artisans before beginning their tasks, and students before commencing their studies. He said it was a soul purifier, and they should all learn it by heart. Shimshon Elia was greatly influenced by his respected great uncle, whom he admired so much, for he considered him perfect in every sense. He recalled a conversation he had had with him when he was still a young boy. It was in connection with old Pinchas. Pinchas at this time was in his 70s, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a long white beard. He had worked terribly hard all his life at all sorts of heavy jobs. But now that he was getting old, Shimshon Elia's father took him into his household to be his handyman, where he could live in greater ease. One day, Shimshon Elia was in his great uncle's room when old Pinchas entered, carrying a bundle of wood to make a fire. As soon as Pinchas came in, Yechiel Moshe stood up and did not take his seat again until old Pinchas had finished making the fire and left the room. Shimshon Elia looked at his great uncle with astonishment. Was not his great uncle a respected personage, and old Pinchas, after all, but a servant? It is true that Pinchas is a servant, but we are told to respect old age without distinction, explained his great uncle, and with a sigh added, how I envy him, earning his living by the work of his own hands. I have so often regretted that I was always supported by my father's money. It can never give one the same satisfaction as earning one's own living. Yechiel Moshe always maintained his attitude of respect towards old Pinchas, and Shimshon Elia thought it very fine. After Yechiel Moshe died, his will was read, where he instructed that after deducting certain legacies to his near relatives, the major part of his money was to be distributed to certain deserving charities, which he named. In addition, a book in which he used to keep his accounts was found, and it was now seen how very extensive and generous had been his gifts and support to numberless needy persons, and all arranged secretly so that the people receiving his charities should not feel degraded at having to accept help. Yes, there was indeed a great and noble man, and it was with a sigh of disappointment that Shimshon Elia compared his late revered great uncle Yechiel Moshe, who had taught him the true meaning of virtue, with his son's present teacher Naphtali Zev, from whom his son could learn Torah, but without its inner teaching of brotherly love. Shimshon Elia was so troubled about his son that, as always, he turned for advice to his lifelong friend Moshe, or, as he was known in Yanovich, Faithful Moshe. Moshe came from Vitebsk, the same as Shimshon Elia. They had been to school together. Shimshon Elia loved and admired his friend, who reminded him so much of his late beloved great uncle Yechiel Moshe. He was equally good-hearted, a great scholar, and noble in every way. When Shimshon Elia was appointed as overseer and manager of the estates of Count Lipsky, he took Moshe with him to be his assistant. Moshe kept the accounts for him, and was his right-hand man. Shimshon Elia had complete confidence in him and made him his personal advisor. There was an absolutely true and frank friendship between them, so much so that Moshe eventually became his guide in all things, and not only did Shimshon Elia not object to being corrected, but he gladly welcomed it, as he knew Moshe only meant it for his good and for the improvement of his character. It was not surprising, therefore, that Shimshon Elia came to him whenever he was in trouble. When Shimshon Elia had been married for some time, he was still without an heir, and this made him and his wife very unhappy. They had wealth, good friends, and a respected place in the community, but they could not be happy so long as they were childless. More than once his wife had her hopes raised, but though she gave birth several times, tragically enough, her baby always died in its infancy. Tell me, said Shimshon Elia to his friend Moshe, what would you advise me to do? I would do anything, if only I had a son to succeed me. I always say everything is for the best, but I cannot feel that this is so in the case of my being childless. Indeed, you have my sympathy, dear friend, said Moshe to him, but you know well as I do that the Almighty is never in the wrong. Therefore, the fault is in yourself. Search your heart well until you find where you have failed. Anyone else in Shimshon Elia's place might have felt insulted at such criticism, but not Shimshon Elia. Indeed, he asked eagerly, Moshe, my dear friend and adviser, how would you advise me to go about it? You should fast and pray very hard, and I am sure our dear Father in heaven will grant you and your wife your dearest desire. Only have faith in him. And when in due course a son was born to Shimshon Elia and his wife, Moshe became, if possible, even dearer to them than before, and certainly his advice was always sought and valued. The child was called Yaakov Yitzchak, and he was the very apple of their eyes to his devoted parents. Nothing was too good for him, and they spent much time and thought on his upbringing and education. When they thought him old enough, Shimshon Elia discussed with faithful Moshe the question of obtaining a teacher for Yaakov Yitzchak. At Shimshon Elia's request, Moshe traveled in search of the best teacher obtainable and came back with Naphtali Zev. It was obvious, therefore, that Shimshon Elia should now again discuss the problem of his son's one-sided education with Moshe, and the latter, feeling to some extent responsible for the failure in choosing a teacher not quite after their hearts, tried in every way to use his own influence in showing Yaakov Yitzchak a better and kinder way of life. Despite all his patient and persistent efforts, he could see that they had absolutely no effect upon Yaakov Yitzchak. The young boy was content to follow his teacher and his ideas, namely, that the study of Torah and carrying out its precepts to the letter, they forgot about the spirit, was ideal and sufficient. If only he could be a little more like his father, thought Moshe. Maybe he will improve in time. I sincerely hope so. When Yaakov Yitzchak grew to manhood, his father took him into his office, showed him how the affairs of the estate were conducted, and gradually gave over the reins of management into his hands. Yaakov Yitzchak had an alert mind, and it did not take him long to get an understanding of the work, so that when he eventually took complete charge, his father was able to leave the affairs of the estate in his care and devote himself to communal matters which were very dear to him. For 50 years, Shimshon Elia served the community, and when he died, he was deeply mourned by all Yanovich, who knew such a man could not easily be replaced. Yaakov Yitzchak enjoyed the same respect and confidence of Count Lipsky as had his father. He proved capable and trustworthy, and the Count was well pleased with him. When the Count died, Yaakov Yitzchak continued to work for his heir and was treated with the same respect as before. Yaakov Yitzchak could not have been happy that had he not found time for Torah study, so he arranged that part of his day should be reserved for studying by himself, and in addition he gave a share for any of the people of Yanovich who cared to attend. Because of his wealth and position, he was considered the lay leader of the town and was consulted in all matters affecting the Jewish community. While he was respected, and by some even feared, he certainly did not hold the affection of the people as had his father before him. Even in matters of charity, in which he gave quite generously, it was obvious that he gave help because he considered it to be his duty, and there was no apparent pleasure in the giving, and there could not therefore be any pleasure in the hearts of the recipients. He forgot that the manner of giving was perhaps even more important than the financial assistance. About 20 years after the death of Shimshon Elia, there arose a dispute among the heirs of Count Lipsky, so that Yaakov Yitzchak felt he would be happier out of it. He wound up all the affairs of the estate and had the accounts checked and verified by the government authorities so that he should leave everything in absolute order He then started to do business in flax and was very successful. Yaakov Yitzchak was very happy in his success. He enjoyed his wealth and his place of honor in the community. He did not care that he was not loved, as was his late father, for he saw no necessity in seeking popularity among people whom, in his conceit, he considered his inferiors. That is why he thought it a great joke to make fun of that poor simple baker, Shlomo, when the latter responded to the Aliyah in the middle of Shema. How different from Yaakov Yitzchak was Avram Yitzchak. Baruch was so impressed with the way Avram Yitzchak treated the baker that he made up his mind to observe him, see how he lived, how he spent his time, and what he could learn from him and about him, for he felt that he was a young man well worth taking notice of. All he discovered convinced him, once again, that here was another example of one who found serving the humble and ordinary folk more worthwhile than anything else.